Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Monday, May 2nd, is federal election day in Canada. Promises to be quite a surprise if the polls turn out to be correct. The left-of-center Social Democratic New Democratic Party may well form the official opposition. May predictions have it as many as 90 and 100 seats. Maybe the Conservative minority government, which is expected, or may be so small, this could actually lead to a coalition of the NDP, the Liberals, and the Bloc Québécois, which could even see Jack Layton, leader of the New Democratic Party, as Prime Minister. Non-Canadians will have no idea how unimaginable that was just a few weeks ago. Now joining us to talk about all of this, first of all, joining us from British Columbia. You are in British Columbia, aren't you, Jamie?
Yeah, that's right, Paul.
Okay, good. Jamie Biggar is the co-founder and executive director of Lead Now, a youth-led activist organization. Ben Powless is in Canada, a member of the Mohawk Nation, I should say a citizen of Mohawk Nation. He's co-founder of the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition, and he's also a member and activist within the Indigenous Environmental Network. Thanks for joining us, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Ben, let's start off with you. If I understand it correctly, you're planning not to vote in this election. Can you tell us why?
Well, as a sovereign member of the Mohawk Nation, a First Nations and Indigenous community in Canada that has never actually been, formally integrated into, really the Canadian Constitution, and one that was basically originally negotiated treaties to operate at a nation-to-nation level of government with the government of Canada. Our government, our people don't really recognize the fact that the federal government has any sort of hierarchy over our people, and have traditionally not participated in the Canadian electoral system, and have instead preferred to proceed and participate in their own governance systems, seeking basically the guaranteed rights to self-determination and self-government, and have those respected by the Canadian government as a preferred sort of goal.
Now, there are certainly members of the various Aboriginal First Nations who do participate. In fact, there's been members of Parliament and such. So do you have any sense of how many Natives do participate in the elections? And those that do, why do they?
Well, I've seen many statistics saying that about 10% of Native populations do participate in the elections, which is basically probably the lowest population of any distinct group within Canada. And I think that more says a whole lot more about the status of Natives and their relationship to the government than a whole lot of things. I think that there are a lot of people who, of course, do want to vote, and of course that is very sort of understandable. There's a lot of social problems, there's a lot of problems that are faced in a lot of First Nations communities, and very few communities see any real progress. And so there's some sort of sense that if some of these policies would have been changed, if some sort of favorable government got in place, then we might see some sort of beneficial changes to a lot of First Nations communities. But up to this point, that hasn't really been a serious consideration.
Right. Jamie, your organization, one of your main activities over the course of the election has been to get out the vote. You ain't getting out Ben's vote. What do you make of that? And what also do you make of the fact that in terms of Native issues, and we know suicide amongst young Native kids is amongst the highest in the world. In many parts of Canada and most prosperous in Ontario, you find half the reserves are boiled water alerts, apparently, that you can't get clean drinking water in many reserves across the country. Yet Native issues are simply a non-issue in this election. So, what do you think, Jamie?
To be honest with you, I don't really feel qualified or in a position to speak to Native issues. I'd have to redirect that back to Ben. I just don't feel qualified to answer that question.
But Ben, what do you make of it? The election, you simply don't hear Native issues being discussed at all.
Yeah, I think Jamie's answer says a lot in the fact that it's not been one of the issues that's come up. It's not been debated in any of the policy debates. It's not something that the leaders get asked routinely, and they don't really have anything that they come out strongly and say this is how we're going to address Native issues. Most parties have basically ignored them or basically offered a slight improvement to the status quo. There's been very, very little discussion about significantly changing the relationship between Canada's national government other levels of government, and other institutions, and First Nations communities and citizens within the country, and really tackling some of the root causes of these incredible crises that you sort of outlined, that have to do with everything from incredible amounts of poverty, the fact that over half of First Nations children across Canada live in poverty, is the current number. The fact that we have the highest number of suicides, the lowest number of education, people going into high schools and even post-secondary education, the astounding numbers of missing and murdered women across Canada, incarceration rates, all these issues, basically summed up, they don't really enter into the sort of modern political debate, and all we hear instead is basically a bunch of old white men debating issues that don't seem to have a lot of relevance to people in First Nations communities who are dealing with these dire needs.
Well, one of the issues that affects Native people, and all Canadians, but I know Native people have been particularly interested in, but so, Jamie, are you. You've been an activist on the climate change environmental question for quite some time. And there's been a little bit of addressing of this, but not a lot. What do you make of the way climate change is being dealt with in the election?
I think one of the things to understand with this election is that all of the parties are, in terms of the kinds of issues that they're speaking to, all of them, with the possible exception of the Greens, but I would say even them to a certain degree, are completely focused on the groups of people that they think are most likely to vote in a couple of swing ridings around the country. So it tends to be older voters, voters that are male voters, older voters, male voters, more prosperous voters, more highly educated voters in 24 3 swing ridings across the country. And all of the messaging and all of the policy is completely focused on those people and their interests, and the interests and the values of the rest of Canadians, which I would say would make up likely at least a majority of Canadians, get left to the side of that, including from a youth perspective, including the focus on climate change is one of the greatest issues of our time, one of the greatest issues of our generation. We're in fact only really seeing climate change now entering into the debate in a significant way in the final days as the NDP have surged ahead and the Conservatives have decided that attacking the NDP for their climate policy will be a successful strategy for them, precisely amongst that subgroup of Canadians that make up the most likely voters in a few swing ridings around the entire country. So we're now seeing attacks on the NDP cap and trade plan as a carbon tax that's going to raise people's electricity bills, because it seemed to be an effective attack on them in those particular places.
Now, a lot of the young people that are coming out to vote for the NDP, a lot of them who haven't voted before, in the past, if they have voted, it's been kind of a stop Harper vote. And sometimes people would kind of decide whether to vote Liberal, vote NDP. But because of the polling showing NDP is a choice that could stop Harper, a lot of more people are coming out to say they're voting NDP. But a lot of young people are doing it precisely because of the climate change issue. They think NDP really has a more effective climate change policy. Ben, do you think they do?
From the reports that I read, they seem to have a fairly strong and credible approach to climate change issues. We're in particular favor and support their call to get Canada to lower its greenhouse gas levels 80% by 2050, and putting in short-term and medium-term steps to get there. In particular, we want to also see make sure that Canada is applying and allowing for proper funding and support for adaptation and mitigation efforts, especially in developing countries and impacted populations, including First Nations in Canada. In comparison with the other parties, I think that the NDP sort of proposal around some specific measures, including the cap and trade, could definitely use some work. And I think that it's been one of the areas that's been sort of trickiest with talking about the NDP, is that they've had some very specific plans, but and some of them are very good, but others I think definitely need to be a little bit more informed. And our organization, for example, the Indigenous Environment Network, is not one that is in favor of a lot of the basic green capitalism fixes to climate change, including talking about just simply putting price mechanisms on carbon, but really in terms of really dealing with a lot of the structural issues, which we see happy the NDP is actually talking about in its candidate from Edmonton, discussions about putting moratoriums on, for example, the extraction of fossil fuels and the tar sands, which are devastating a number of First Nations communities in the area. It's those kind of things that I think we need to really be having serious conversations and really try to reconcile with, and not just put sort of band-aid solutions that kind of look good. And in that comparison, I think that the NDP plan probably stands out stronger than the other plans. But I haven't looked into depth into, for example,
Right.
the green
Now,
plan.
when I look at the NDP official program, the whole strategy about climate change and carbon emissions seems to be centered around a cap and trade program. I'll read a little bit of it to you here. It says, we'll put a price on carbon through a cap and trade system, which will establish hard emission limits for Canada's biggest polluters to ensure companies pay their environmental bills, to create an incentive for emission reductions. But then you say to yourself, okay, that sounds good, but how is that going to be accomplished? And here's the next point. They say we'll work closely with the Obama administration in Washington to ensure a coordinated response to climate change. We'll seek at every opportunity to advance an integrated continental cap and trade system. Let me read that again. Integrated continental cap and trade system that ensures a level economic playing field for North American businesses. So I take from that means, number one, a cap and trade system like the Obama plan, which is a kind of derivatives trading that also allows offsets for what most people think are completely unaccountable. You could have supposedly some tree gets put up in Peru and a factory in Canada gets to say they've cut their carbon emissions because they've sold off the offset. But most evidence so far is that seems to be very ineffective. And who knows what gets passed in Washington. And right now, no cap and trade's getting passed in Washington. So, Jamie, how effective a proposal is this?
Yeah, I think it's concerning that it's linked to the United States. I mean, both in terms of the timing of its implementation and in terms of the actual content. I mean, by linking to the United States, you're essentially setting the bar for Canadian climate policy at a level that's going to be decided by quite either conservative Democrat or obviously very conservative Republican senators in some oil-rich, coal-rich, and manufacturing heavy swing states in the United States, and where the bar goes when you peg your policy to the U.S. So I think that's definitely of concern. I think one of the things that do like about the NDP plan is that it focuses on raising revenue from the carbon tax plan, the cap and trade plan, and also from adding a cent to the gas tax. It focuses that money onto investment in renewable energy, and in particular into improved public transit. So that side, I think quite happy with, and happy to see the focus on moving those funds into renewable energy and into public transit. But definitely concerned about both the timing and the structure of the cap and trade plan, given that it's going to be linked to the United States.
Ben, are you at all concerned about the NDP's plan? And I mean, I understand that people from a kind of progressive position see Harper as someone who probably doesn't even, at least based on real action, doesn't seem to think there really is a climate change problem. But
No.
is the NDP plan a bit Obama-esque in the sense that it's kind of a green capitalism, but not very necessarily very effective?
Right. I think you highlight some of the main issues there. Is that it starts to identify the problem, but the solutions that it puts forward, I think, are completely inadequate. And like you identified, could end up creating some sort of false offsets, some sort of false solutions to be proposed and implemented in place of that program. And I want to tell a little story. Is that in the U.S., when Obama came in, they basically hired a sort of green economy czar, and that was Van Jones, who became very sort of public figure, came from the green economy movement in the U.S., and he was one of the ones that was behind this big push for the cap and trade system and this whole sort of solution in the U.S. And the whole thing kind of, as you notice, fumbled. They basically lost the bill, and it didn't get passed. And I recently saw him give a talk in California, and he was basically saying that, the lesson that they learned was that, we're all right, businesses don't want cap and trade. What's the alternative? It's a type of command and control. It's where you actually set actual limits for these industries that they have to comply with, and you set, sort of either fines or whatever sort of other legal implements to make sure that they sort of comply with these. And you can rely on taxes and other things in the meanwhile to sort of generate this revenue that helps build an alternative economy and sort of alternative structures. But it's that kind of approach that I think is really necessary in this era that, you know, we really can't afford to start implementing loopholes like offsetting and like other ways to buy our way out of this real crisis, the way that the U.S. has really been pushing within the climate change negotiations.
Jamie, your organization's been mostly about getting out the vote the last few weeks. Are young people responding?
Yeah, there's been a real surge, especially in the last week and a half. We saw at advanced polls last week a 34% increase in the number of people turning out to advanced polls compared to the 2008 election, and as part of that, a significant chunk of those were young people heading out to the polls. And we're hearing more and more excitement from a lot of places around the country, particularly from university campuses. I think we're still concerned that there are large chunks of the youth population, especially young people who aren't at university or aren't part of campus life, but are out in the workforce or are unemployed, who are probably not getting caught up in this kind of voting, this surge in voting interest that's occurred, and so we're still concerned that there are a lot of people who feel deeply alienated by the political system and like that it's not speaking to them and that they're not being reached by it. But we're excited to see that there's also been this growth in interest, and I think excited by that because we're hoping that it'll help contribute to changing the status quo in Ottawa come Monday.
Thank you both for joining us, and we'll come back to you about all of this after Monday, and we'll see whether in fact there's been this NDP breakthrough. Thank you, and thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks.